So we all know that everything changed for art in the 1990s in East Central Europe, but it also changed significantly for the discipline of art history. Local narratives started to be written and rewritten, often taking into account for the first time much of the unofficial activity that had been going on under communism, including performance art. The 1990s was also the time when performance, already a well-established genre, started to be revised and re-performed across the globe for various reasons. One of the first artistic reenactments in Eastern Europe took place right here in Tallinn in 1990, Trio for Piano, and I owe my understanding of this reenactment to Anu Alas, who recently published an article on it in Art Margins. According to Alas, when Andu Keskula, Ulevi Eliand, and Leonard Lapin re-performed the piece, they did so in the context of a new world order to assert their presence as established members of the art community and canonize their work during that potent period in political history. The artists, who were students in the 1970s and forced to confine their experimental work to their own private activity, suddenly faced a younger generation of artists in post-Soviet Estonia engaging openly and freely with performance without much knowledge of their pioneering activity. The reenactment of this early and important but lesser known and certainly not canonized happening was an attempt to cement their position as avant-garde artists of contemporary Estonian art. This was a similar conclusion drawn by Thomas Zalushki with regard to the performances of Eva Pardum's actions for her major retrospective in Poland. In writing about performance art in Eastern Europe, I have argued that the reasons and motivations for creating performances in East Central Europe were often different than the motivations in the West. In thinking about reenactments of performances, I wonder whether the interpretation of re-performance should also be considered differently in East Central Europe. For example, could the re-performance of works that were first enacted during the communist period serve as a performance of history? Could these re-performances enlighten contemporary viewers as to the material and experiential differences between then and now? My original contention that re-performances were or could somehow be used differently in East Central Europe is thwarted by the examples in Tallinn and Poland. In both cases, the artists in question did not use re-performance to perform history, but rather to reinforce or confirm their place in the local art historical canon, much like Marina Abramovic did in 7 Easy Pieces. However, one other example sticks out in my mind. In 2009, the NGO Container, the Bureau of Contemporary Art in Zagreb, organized The Orange Dog and Other Tales, Even Better Than the Real Thing, a series of reenactments billed as an art history play in which body and performance artworks from the then unwritten history of Croatian performance art were re-performed. This was done as an attempt to perform the history of performance art in Croatia, and the curators state that the project, quote, uses a series of reenactments to create an art history theater play whose plot evolves into a history of Croatian performance art. It is the work of art historians turned into a drama instead of a scientific paper, end quote. In this instance, performance and its reenactment functions as research, with the artist performing the function of the art historian, critic, or institution. Rather than writing that history, the curators turned it into an action to be witnessed, experienced, and embodied. The experience of the 1990s for me is very much connected with East Central Europe. While I never experienced life behind the Iron Curtain, I believe I had a glimpse of it during my experiences in the region in that decade. One particular experience stands out in my mind. I have vivid memories of walking around Moscow in 1996, seeing a number of people inexplicably eating bananas as one would eat an ice cream cone, the peels hanging down at the sides of the fruit. In Poland in 1997, I remember wondering why the kiosks by the train stations were piled high with bananas, a sight I had never seen outside the fruit aisle of my local Connecticut grocery store. 10 years after my first experience in Poland, I started my PhD on the art of Eastern Europe and Russia and came across the work of Natalia L.L., whose fetishization of the banana during a period of deficit made so much sense to me, having witnessed that fetishization myself immediately following that period. When I teach courses on Russian art or performance art in Eastern Europe, I spend a lot of time describing to my students the space, not the place, the space in which these actions took place, the atmosphere, the environment, the material conditions, using both my experiences in Eastern Europe in the recently made post-communist space of the 1990s, as well as the recollections of friends told to me about the communist period. Many of my students who are in fact from Eastern Europe, born in the late 1990s, tell me that my descriptions of that time echo those told to them by their parents. So, going hand in hand with the teaching of performance art in Eastern Europe is the teaching of the space. Last weekend at the inaugural conference of the newly formed Piotr Petrovsky Center for Research on East Central European Art, Paulina Morganova spoke about her recent publication, a proverbial guidebook of performance artworks that took place in Prague in the 1960s through 1980s. As part of her research, Morganova revisited all of the spaces where the performances took place with the artists. At the conference, she commented on how profoundly this impacted her understanding of the performances, noting, for example, how Peter Stembera's Sleeping in a Tree took place in a tree in the garden of a private home. She, like many others, had imagined the tree out in the middle of the countryside or forest, a much less safe space than a backyard garden. Indeed, this comment speaks of the limitation of the documentation of performance art, as each photograph presents just one corner of the location, focusing on the action, and cropping out the majority of the data about the space in which it took place. So I think that the reenactments of performance art in Eastern Europe can function as the performance of history when both the action and the space are considered consequently. Take, for example, the following two examples. The first, a series of reperformances by Barbara Klimova in the Czech Republic, enacted in 2006. And I don't have any images of these, I haven't been able to find any. In reperforming a work of experimental live art from the socialist period in Eastern Europe in the present day, there is a significant shift in socio-political context from the original act. When Jiří Kovanda created a number of performances on the streets of Prague in the 1970s, he was able to do so primarily because they were entirely invisible. Theater, for example, which he performed in Wenceslas Square in the center of the city in 1976, involved the artist enacting a series of everyday gestures, such as scratching his nose and brushing his hand through his hair, all imperceptible as a performance, and only enacted long enough for the photographer to document the action. Klimova's reenactments brought Kovanda's works into the dramatically different context of the post-communist present in the Czech Republic. She also changed the location of several of the performances, enacting them in different spots than the original, as well as changing the city. And she also changed the gender of the original artists, all of whom were male. The reenactments transplanted the artworks from a context in which these acts were only able to function as art if the artistic aspect of the work was clandestine, to one in which they could be openly acknowledged as art and performed as works of performance art. In this regard, the reperformance in the post-socialist period of experimental artworks from the 1960s and 1970s in Eastern Europe has the potential to transform the meaning, reception, and significance of these acts by presenting them in a similar space, but a context entirely different from whence they emerged. This was precisely Klimova's motivation for reenacting these performances. In addition to Kovanda's work, she reenacted performances by 4 other artists from the Czech art scene in the 1970s and 80s, in order to better understand the socio-political and cultural space in which they were created. And that's how she described why she did the performances. One of the artists whose work she reenacted, Milan Kozelka, challenged her, quote, "Why do you want to do these reconstructions? The performances will lose their meaning at this time," end quote. But for Klimova, this change in meaning is precisely the point. Consequently, the reenactment of performances from the socialist period in post-socialist Central and Eastern Europe can provide unique insight into the socio-cultural shifts that took place during the gap in time between the original act and its reiteration. By contrast, in 2008, Masca Ljubljana created a series of re-performances in Ljubljana under the banner of Archive Contaminated with History. Among the reenactments was Tomislav Gotovac's first streaking performance, which took place in I didn't realize that loud. So it's just one scene. It's interesting that it's considered a performance that gets re-performed because it was actually part of a film. He's yelling, "I'm innocent," as he runs down the street. And then this is the re-performance that took place in Ljubljana. By Samo Gosaric. In Samo Gosaric's 2008 re-performance, the space of the performances changed from sunny Belgrade in 1971 to a rainy, sleety Ljubljana in the 21st century. Instead of running down a cobblestone street, Gosaric runs through a public square. Instead of barefooted, he has shoes protecting him from the uneven cobblestones and from the cold. The material and environmental conditions of the performance could not be more different. Miško Šivaković has described Gosaric's actions, and he did many of these in Ljubljana, including actions by Kovanda, not as reenactments, but appropriation, recycling, and cold identification, with the purpose of answering, quote, the demand for a demystification of the neo-avant-garde myths that have become essential proto-utopian references in the age of the great financial crisis at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, end quote. But I think the reenactment or recycling illustrates my point. This action of Gosaric tells us nothing about the original performance, nor the changed socio-political circumstances, because its circumstances, in particular the variables that are controllable, such as dress, weather, and physical location, are so drastically altered. The numerous contrasts between the original and the reenactment only serve to underscore the significance of place and space to the reenactment and to its use with regard to creating an understanding of history. In thinking about the significance of space in relation to performance in the region, I started to wonder whether space had the same significance for performances in the West. Was it important that Vito Acconci's seedbed took place precisely in the Sonnabend Gallery in Soho? Could it have been enacted in any gallery on the Lower East Side? Was the locale of upstate New York, in particular the area nearby Cornell University in Ithaca, central to the meaning and understanding of Caprau's household? While I know that it is significant that the former happened in a New York gallery and the latter in the countryside outside of the gallery, I would argue that those particular spaces were not, in fact, central. By contrast, we know of the significance of the basement of the Museum of Applied Arts to the history of performance art in Czechoslovakia. Clandestine performances had to take place there because Peter Stembera had a job as a night guard, enabling him access to that particular space. Performances could not be enacted in the official space of the museum, so they were forced to take place, in this instance, literally underground and in the dark, after hours. A similar case can be seen in Estonia's own Siim Tänalanos's performances in his garden on Mooney Street. Where else could the artist perform these spectacles, which became more and more grand as the 1980s rolled on, than in the private space of his garden? Having visited there myself, much of the activity of that time started to make sense to me. The expansive space of the garden, although he's told me it's bigger than, there's more property there than he owned at the time. The fact that it was secluded and on the edge of Tallinn, as well as the proximity of the neighbors who kept a watchful eye on the activity and often called the police. I'm not saying that all performances that took place in Eastern Europe were tied to the specific place. Mirvaldis Puolis's Bronze Man performances, who Anu mentioned that I've written about extensively, took place in the center of Riga. I don't think that these specific streets he walked along particularly mattered. I do think, however, that the performance was only possible in the late Soviet space of perestroika. And evidence of this can be seen in the manner in which one of his artistic colleagues, Andris Greenbergs, an artist and fashion designer, was often pursued by police in the 1970s for his eccentric dress, often appearing in public dressed as a hippie. Also at the conference in Poznan last week, and I apologize for referring to it, but I do think it's important to keep the dialogue going, we talked about terminology. At the close of the conference, Stephen Mansbach commented that we in the East are still using the terms of the West to describe the art that we write about. This comment was met with fierce opposition, which led me to believe that something had struck a nerve, and I think there is some truth there. In many ways, art historians of East Central Europe, including myself, refer to scholars, theorists, and terms produced in the West, by the West, for the West. Of course, that is not universally the case, and we have many great examples of theory and terminology produced in the region. But performance art is a good example. Many scholars in the region, including myself, refer to Peggy Fallon, Amelia Jones, and Claire Bishop, whose engagement with the region is varied from not at all to somewhat to not great. The term performance itself was adopted by many artists in Eastern Europe in the 1970s after they learned that what they were doing, actions, art with the body, etc., had a name, performance. The use of the term was clever and strategic. It helped to link this independent and unofficial activity, meaning unacknowledged by institutions, with that of the center. In many ways similar to artists adopting the models and techniques set out by Soros in the 1990s. For many artists, the term performance gave legitimacy to their work, and following the adoption of that term, it makes sense that re-performance would also be used. But after the discussion in Poznan, I started thinking about what different terms we could use that might even be more accurate in capturing what is going on. Recontextualization came to mind. But I think it's not just the context that's changing. Maybe reactivation, bringing to life something from the past. I also thought of reactualization, from actualization to turn into action or fact. In that case, perhaps just actualization, to turn the unofficial activity of the past into a fact or canonical action from the past. The idea to rethink the terminology only came to me a few days ago, and that's why my title has also changed. So I admit that I don't have an answer yet. I also realize that my paper has raised more questions than answered them, but because I believe that the discourse of the field is being shaped at conferences such as these, I look forward to hearing your feedback and comments as I continue to develop these ideas in my next project. Thank you.